14 years ago, on a crisp October night in Moscow, Idaho, 19-year-old Nancy Robinson stepped out of a local bar into the autumn mist, never to be seen alive again. Her silver Honda Civic vanished with her into the darkness, leaving investigators grasping at shadows and her family drowning in anguish. Police theorized a random abduction, a college girl in the wrong place at the wrong time. But with 2011's limited forensic technology and a flood of conflicting tips, the case eventually crumbled into silence. Yet Nancy's mother refused to surrender hope, keeping her daughter's bedroom frozen in time and lighting a candle on the front porch every single night for over a decade, until advanced DNA analysis breathed life back into forgotten evidence, revealing a truth so shocking it would shatter this tight-knit university town forever. Before we dive into this shocking story, let us know where you're watching from, and don't forget to hit subscribe for more investigations. The neon lights of CJ's Tavern cast an amber glow across Moscow's rain-slicked streets on October 15, 2011. Steam rose from the wet pavement as University of Idaho students moved between bars, their laughter echoing off brick buildings that had watched over this college town for generations. The air carried the scent of fallen leaves and the promise of winter, while streetlights created halos in the evening mist that clung to the Palouse hills surrounding the city. Inside CJ's, Nancy Robinson sat at a corner table with three of her closest friends, her infectious laugh rising above the din of weekend revelry. At 19, Nancy possessed the kind of radiant energy that drew people to her like moths to flame. Her long auburn hair caught the bar's dim lighting as she gestured animatedly, describing her latest education class assignment. She was studying to become an elementary school teacher, driven by a passion for helping children discover their potential. Her friends often joked that Nancy had been born to teach. She possessed an innate ability to explain complex concepts in simple terms, and her patience seemed endless. She was the glue that held our friend group together, recalls Sarah Martinez, Nancy's roommate and closest confidant. When someone was struggling with coursework, Nancy was there with flashcards and encouragement. When relationships fell apart, she'd show up with ice cream and terrible movies. She made everyone around her feel valued. That particular Saturday evening, Nancy seemed especially animated. She'd just received acceptance into the university's competitive student teaching program, a milestone that brought her one step closer to her dream classroom. Her boyfriend, Jake Thompson, was supposed to join them, but had canceled due to a family emergency. Nancy had briefly considered staying home, but decided not to waste the babysitter her younger siblings' parents had arranged. The group ordered their usual. Nancy always chose a Moscow Mule, claiming the ginger beer reminded her of her grandmother's homemade ginger ale. They talked about upcoming midterms, Halloween plans, and Nancy's excitement about observing at a local elementary school the following week. Security footage would later show Nancy checking her phone multiple times, likely texting with Jake and ensuring her three younger siblings were settled at home. Around 11:45 p.m., Nancy announced she needed to head home. Her father had set a midnight curfew, not out of distrust, but because Nancy had volunteered to help with Sunday morning pancakes for the family's weekly tradition. Her friends offered to walk her to her car, parked just 2 blocks away, but Nancy waved them off with characteristic independence. "I'll text you when I get home," she promised Sarah, pulling on her favorite burgundy jacket, a thrift store find she'd worn to nearly every social gathering that semester. The security camera captured her final wave as she stepped into the misty October night, her silhouette disappearing between the shadows of downtown Moscow's quiet streets. Nancy's silver 2009 Honda Civic was parked under a broken streetlight on 3rd Street, a detail that would later haunt investigators. The 6-minute drive to her family's home on the outskirts of town was a route she'd traveled hundreds of times. At 12:03 a.m., her phone pinged with a text to Sarah, "Almost home, see you tomorrow." The message showed she was approximately 2 miles from her house, traveling along Highway 8 toward the residential area where she'd grown up. But Nancy Robinson would never make it home. At 12:37 a.m., her cell phone signal vanished completely, cutting the final thread connecting her to the world she'd known. When dawn broke over Moscow's tree-lined streets, It illuminated a mystery that would consume this peaceful university town for the next 14 years. Dawn crept across the Palouse Hills on October 16, 2011, painting the Robinson family's front porch in soft golden light. The porch light, a beacon Nancy's mother, Linda Robinson, always left burning until her daughter returned home, still glowed against the morning sky, a silent testament that something was terribly wrong. Inside the modest two-story house on Elm Street, Linda stirred at 6 a.m., as she had every Sunday for the past 15 years, ready to begin preparations for the family's weekly pancake breakfast. Nancy was supposed to help. It was their tradition. Started when Nancy turned 13 and declared herself old enough to flip pancakes without making a mess. But Nancy's bedroom door remained closed. Unusual for someone who typically bounded downstairs by 6:30, coffee already brewing and ingredients assembled. Linda knocked gently, then pushed open the door to find Nancy's bed unslept in, still perfectly made with the purple comforter Nancy had chosen for her freshman year. Her laptop sat closed on the desk, textbooks stacked neatly beside it. The sight sent ice through Linda's veins. Nancy never left without making her bed look lived in, a quirky habit that drove her younger siblings crazy. "Tom," Linda's voice carried down the hallway, sharp with a panic she couldn't yet name. "Tom, get up now." Nancy's father, Tom Robinson, had been a Moscow firefighter for 22 years. He'd responded to countless emergencies, developed an intuition for when situations were genuinely dangerous versus merely concerning. The tone in his wife's voice triggered every alarm bell in his experienced mind. Within minutes, the entire Robinson household was awake. Nancy's siblings, Marcus, 16, Emma, 14, and little Sophie, just 11, gathered in the living room as their parents tried to piece together the previous evening. Nancy's car wasn't in the driveway. Her purse wasn't on the kitchen counter where she always dropped it. Her phone went straight to voicemail. "She texted me she was almost home," Sarah Martinez confirmed, when Linda called at 7:15 a.m., her voice thick with sleep and growing concern. That was right after midnight. She should have been there by 12:10, maybe 12:15 at the latest. Tom immediately drove Nancy's usual route home, his firefighter's trained eye scanning ditches and side roads for any sign of the silver Honda Civic. The morning was crisp and clear, yesterday's mist having lifted to reveal the rolling wheat fields and pine forests that surrounded Moscow. He stopped at every curve, every intersection, looking for skid marks, broken glass, any evidence of an accident, but Highway 8 stretched empty and unmarked, offering no clues about his daughter's fate. By 8 a.m., Linda had called every friend in Nancy's contact list. The story was always the same. Nancy had seemed happy and normal at CJ's, had left alone around 11:45, and had texted she was almost home. No one had seen her since. No one had any reason to worry, until this moment. The Moscow Police Department was just beginning its Sunday shift when Tom Robinson walked through their doors at 8:47 a.m. Sergeant Mike Chen, a 15-year veteran who'd watched Nancy grow up in the community, immediately recognized the controlled panic in Tom's eyes. "Something's wrong," Tom said simply. "Nancy never comes home. Never." Chen had processed enough missing person reports to know that most cases involving young adults were resolved within 24 hours, usually with embarrassing explanations about unplanned sleepovers or dead cell phone batteries. But Tom Robinson wasn't a panicking parent prone to overreaction. He was a respected first responder who understood genuine emergencies. Within 30 minutes, a bolo alert went out for Nancy's Honda Civic. License plate number, vehicle description, and Nancy's photograph were distributed to every law enforcement agency within a 50-mile radius. Chen personally drove Nancy's route home, retracing Tom's earlier search with official authority and a trained investigator's eye. The Moscow Police Department's dispatch center began receiving the first tips by 10 a.m. A bartender at CJ's confirmed Nancy had left alone around midnight. A night shift worker at the gas station on Highway 8 thought he might have seen a silver car around 12:30, but couldn't be certain. A truck driver reported possible headlights in his rearview mirror near the Palouse River Bridge, but the timing was uncertain. By noon, when Nancy would have been serving her famous chocolate chip pancakes to her siblings, Over 200 people had joined the search. The University of Idaho sent out a campus-wide alert. Local news stations picked up the story. Nancy's photograph, a recent headshot showing her bright smile and kind eyes, began appearing on television screens across the inland Northwest. But as Sunday's shadows lengthened and the October sun began its descent toward the western hills, Nancy Robinson remained missing. Her bedroom stayed empty, her bed remained perfectly made, and her family's worst fears began crystallizing into a terrible reality they weren't prepared to face. Monday morning brought a coordination of resources that Moscow, Idaho had never seen before. The police department's small conference room transformed into a makeshift command center, its walls now covered with detailed topographical maps of Latah County, marked with colored pins, indicating search zones, potential sighting locations, and areas of interest. The October sunlight streaming through the windows illuminated faces drawn tight with determination and growing concern. Detective Ray Martinez, no relation to Nancy's roommate Sarah, had been assigned as lead investigator, with 18 years of experience in law enforcement, including a stint with the Idaho State Police. Martinez understood that the first 72 hours were critical in missing person cases. He'd seen too many searches that started with hope and ended with heartbreak. "We're treating this as an active abduction until evidence suggests otherwise," Martinez announced to the assembled team of local officers, sheriff's deputies and FBI consultants who'd driven over from Spokane. Nancy Robinson is not the type of young woman who disappears voluntarily. Everyone who knows her confirms that. The search began at first light with systematic precision. Latah County Search and Rescue deployed 3 German Shepherd tracking dogs, starting from the parking spot where Nancy's car had been located outside CJ's Tavern. The dogs picked up Nancy's scent immediately, following it along 3rd Street toward the edge of downtown. But at the intersection with Highway 8, the trail simply vanished, consistent with Nancy getting into a vehicle. Helicopter pilot Sarah Runninghorse had volunteered her services through the county sheriff's department. For 3 consecutive days, she flew grid patterns over the dense forests and deep ravines that characterized the Palouse region. From her aerial perspective, she could see how easily a vehicle could disappear among the thick stands of Douglas fir and ponderosa pine, or how the winding gravel roads that served local farms could conceal evidence for months. "The terrain here is unforgiving," Runninghorse explained to families gathered at the command center. "But it also means that if Nancy's car is out there, we'll find it. Metal doesn't hide forever in these conditions." Meanwhile, digital forensics specialist Jennifer Walsh worked to trace Nancy's final communications. The cell phone data painted a clear picture of Nancy's movements until 12:37 a.m., when her phone either lost signal or was deliberately turned off. The final ping had come from a cell tower that covered approximately 15 square miles of rural territory, a vast area that included working farms, abandoned logging roads, and the Palouse River's winding tributaries. In 2011, our technological capabilities were more limited than they are today, Walsh later reflected. "We could track general location data, but pinpointing exact coordinates required much more sophisticated equipment than what was available to local law enforcement." The investigation team conducted interviews with every person known to have been at CJ's Tavern that Saturday night. Bartender Mike Stevens recalled Nancy as a regular customer who always ordered the same drink and always left appropriate tips. Security footage showed her interacting normally with friends, displaying no signs of distress or concern. The video quality was grainy, typical of surveillance systems from that era, but clear enough to establish that Nancy had left the bar alone and appeared completely normal. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, a forensic psychologist consulting on the case, created a behavioral profile based on witness interviews and Nancy's personal history. This young woman was extremely responsible, family-oriented, and goal-focused, Harper concluded. The probability of voluntary disappearance is essentially 0. We're looking at either an accident with the car going off-road into difficult terrain or an encounter with someone who meant her harm. Local volunteers organized search parties that combed through every accessible area within a 20-mile radius of Nancy's last known location. University students suspended classes to join the effort. Faculty members provided coffee and sandwiches. Local businesses donated supplies and equipment. The Robinson family's church organized prayer vigils that drew hundreds of community members each evening. Nancy's boyfriend Jake Thompson submitted to multiple interviews and polygraph examinations, all of which confirmed his alibi. He'd been in Coeur d'Alene dealing with his grandmother's medical emergency, with hospital records and family members corroborating his presence there throughout the weekend. But as the first week stretched into the second, the brutal reality of missing person investigations began to settle over the command center. Despite hundreds of volunteers, thousands of man-hours, and increasingly sophisticated search techniques, no trace of Nancy Robinson or her silver Honda Civic had been found. The forests and ravines of Latah County had seemingly swallowed both without leaving a single clue behind. The University of Idaho campus had never experienced anything like the collective mobilization that followed Nancy Robinson's disappearance. By the end of October 2011, her face had become the most recognizable image in Moscow, appearing on flyers taped to every lamppost, bulletin board, and storefront window throughout the city. The bright smile captured in her student ID photo seemed to follow residents as they went about their daily routines, a constant reminder that one of their own was missing. Students organized themselves with the efficiency of a military operation. The Kappa Delta sorority, which Nancy had pledged the previous spring, established a 24-hour tip line staffed by volunteers in the Student Union building. Psychology major Jennifer Adams coordinated teams that distributed missing person flyers as far away as Spokane and Boise, understanding that if Nancy had been taken, she could be anywhere within a day's drive of Moscow. Nancy was the kind of person who remembered your birthday, who noticed when you were struggling with something, Adams recalled during a candlelight vigil held on the university's administration building lawn. She'd tutor anyone who needed help, never asking for anything in return. That's why this feels so personal to all of us. The vigil drew over 800 people on a cold Tuesday evening, their candles creating a sea of flickering light that could be seen from the surrounding hills. Nancy's parents stood at the center, Linda Robinson clutching a framed photograph of Nancy from her high school graduation, Tom's arm wrapped protectively around his wife's shoulders. Their other children flanked them, Marcus trying to project adult strength at 16, Emma openly weeping, little Sophie clinging to her mother's hand with wide, frightened eyes. Local businesses responded with unprecedented generosity. The Moscow Pullman Daily News donated front-page space every day for 2 weeks, keeping Nancy's story in the public eye. Radio stations ran hourly announcements. The Breakfast Club restaurant on Main Street posted Nancy's photograph next to their cash register and offered a free meal to anyone who provided information about her whereabouts. But with community engagement came a flood of tips that quickly overwhelmed local law enforcement resources. The Moscow Police Department received over 300 calls in the first 2 weeks, each requiring follow-up investigation. Detective Martinez assigned officers to verify every credible lead, no matter how unlikely it seemed. A truck driver reported seeing a silver sedan pulled over on Highway 95 north of Coeur d'Alene around 1 a.m. on October 16, but couldn't provide specific details about the vehicle or its occupants. A waitress at a diner in Lewiston thought she'd served coffee to a young woman matching Nancy's description on Sunday morning, but security footage was inconclusive. Multiple callers reported abandoned vehicles in remote locations throughout the region, sending search teams on wild goose chases that ended with rusted farm trucks and hunters' abandoned ATVs. The most promising lead came from David Kawai, a graduate student who'd been studying late in the university library. Kawai reported seeing a silver Honda Civic that matched Nancy's description parked at the Palouse River overlook around 12:45 a.m. on October. He'd noticed it because the car was running with its headlights on, but no one was visible inside. "I almost stopped to see if someone needed help," Kawai told investigators. "But I was running late getting home, and I figured maybe someone was just taking a phone call or something. I keep thinking about what might have happened if I'd stopped." Search teams spent 3 days combing the area around the river overlook, using diving equipment to explore the deeper pools where a car might have gone into the water. But the Palouse River revealed nothing except decades of accumulated debris and several rusted appliances that local farmers had dumped over the years. Another significant lead emerged from CJ's Tavern itself. Bartender Ana Rodriguez remembered a man who'd been sitting alone at the far end of the bar that Saturday night, nursing a single beer for several hours while watching Nancy's table. She described him as average height, wearing a baseball cap pulled low, possibly in his 30s or 40s. He'd paid his tab in cash, around the same time Nancy left, which Rodriguez found unusual since most customers used cards. He wasn't doing anything obviously creepy, Rodriguez explained to Detective Martinez, but there was something about the way he was watching. Not like he was interested in picking someone up, more like he was studying them. It made me uncomfortable, but I see weird behavior every night working in a bar. Unfortunately, CJ's security cameras hadn't captured a clear image of the man, and no other witnesses could provide additional details. The lead generated dozens of tips about suspicious men in baseball caps, but none led to concrete evidence. As November arrived and brought the first snows to the Palouse Hills, the community's initial surge of optimism began to temper with the reality that Nancy might not be coming home for Thanksgiving. The Robinson family announced they would maintain their traditional dinner, setting a place for Nancy at the table and keeping her favorite cranberry sauce recipe on the menu. "We're not giving up," Linda Robinson told the gathered media outside their home. "Someone knows something. Someone saw something. We just need them to find the courage to come forward." Winter descended on Latah County with unusual severity in December 2011, blanketing the investigation in literal and metaphorical cold. Snowdrifts reached 3 feet in some areas, making remote search locations inaccessible and forcing Detective Martinez to reconsider his approach to Nancy Robinson's case. The conference room that had buzzed with activity during the initial search efforts now felt hollow, its walls still covered with maps that seemed to mock the investigation's lack of progress. The challenges facing Martinez and his team were both technological and practical. In 2011, DNA analysis required substantial biological samples and could take weeks to process. Cell phone data was less precise than modern standards, often providing general location information rather than specific coordinates. Security camera systems were analog, producing grainy footage that made identification difficult even under ideal circumstances. "We were working with the tools we had," Martinez later reflected. But those tools weren't designed for the kind of sophisticated investigation that Nancy's case demanded. Every lead felt like it should break the case wide open, but then we'd hit another wall. The most frustrating dead end involved a potential suspect who'd emerged from the bar surveillance footage. Enhanced analysis had revealed a figure leaving CJ's Tavern approximately 5 minutes after Nancy, but the image quality was too poor to make a positive identification. The person appeared to be wearing dark clothing and a baseball cap, consistent with bartender Ana Rodriguez's description, but that description could fit thousands of men in the Moscow area. State Crime Lab technician Robert Kim worked for months, trying to extract usable DNA evidence from Nancy's car, which had been recovered from a long-term parking lot at the Spokane airport 6 weeks after her disappearance. The vehicle showed no signs of struggle or violence, but Kim detected trace amounts of foreign DNA on the passenger side door handle, evidence that someone else had touched Nancy's car. "The problem was that we had DNA, but we had no suspect to compare it against," Kim explained. "Without a match in Cadiz or a voluntary sample from a suspect, that DNA evidence was essentially useless. It would just sit in storage, waiting for forensic science to catch up with our needs." The investigation team pursued numerous false leads that consumed resources without advancing the case. A confidential informant claimed that Nancy had been killed by a drug dealer she'd allegedly been dating, but extensive investigation revealed Nancy had no connection to drug activity and the informant was attempting to collect reward money while settling unrelated scores. Another dead end involved a series of anonymous letters sent to the police department, claiming knowledge of Nancy's location. The letters, written in block letters and mailed from different locations around the Pacific Northwest, provided detailed descriptions of supposed burial sites and elaborate theories about Nancy's murder. Each letter triggered extensive search efforts that yielded nothing but wasted time and false hope. Perhaps the most heartbreaking false lead came from a woman in Portland who claimed to have seen Nancy working at a coffee shop 6 months after her disappearance. The sighting seemed credible. The witness provided specific details about Nancy's appearance and mannerisms that weren't widely known to the public. Detective Martinez drove to Portland personally, accompanied by Linda Robinson, who was desperately hopeful for any sign of her daughter. The coffee shop employee bore a superficial resemblance to Nancy, but fingerprint analysis definitively proved she was not Nancy Robinson. The woman was actually a runaway from California who'd been living under a false identity. While Martinez was able to reunite her with her own worried family, the emotional crash for Linda Robinson was devastating. "I allowed myself to believe," Linda said during the difficult drive back to Moscow. "For 12 hours, I thought I was going to hold my daughter again. Going back to not knowing felt worse than the original disappearance." By spring 2012, the investigation had expanded to include FBI behavioral analysts and specialists in missing persons cases. They created detailed profiles of potential suspects and analyzed similar cases from across the Pacific Northwest, looking for patterns that might indicate a serial offender. But Nancy's case didn't fit established patterns. It seemed to be an isolated incident without clear motive or methodology. The FBI's involvement did bring more sophisticated resources, including advanced computer modeling and enhanced surveillance analysis. However, even federal capabilities couldn't overcome the fundamental challenge. Without Nancy's body, her car, or a credible witness to her final moments, investigators were essentially working blind. Detective Martinez implemented a grid search protocol that divided Latah County into numbered sections, each systematically examined by search teams over the course of several months. Volunteers continued to respond, but the initial community enthusiasm had been tempered by repeated disappointments and the harsh reality that Nancy might never be found. As 2012 turned into 2013, and then 2014, Martinez watched the case file grow thick with dead ends, false leads, and inconclusive evidence. Each new tip generated hope, but also skepticism born from too many previous disappointments. The silver Honda Civic had vanished as completely as Nancy herself, despite extensive searches of impound lots, salvage yards, and remote locations throughout the Northwest. By the autumn of 2014, 3 years after Nancy Robinson's disappearance, the daily rhythm of search efforts and active investigation had settled into something quieter but no less persistent. The Moscow Police Department officially reclassified Nancy's case as cold, a designation that made Linda Robinson physically ill when Detective Martinez delivered the news on a gray October afternoon that felt too much like the day Nancy had vanished. The Robinson family home on Elm Street had become a shrine to hope and stubborn denial of loss. Nancy's bedroom remained exactly as she'd left it that final Saturday night, textbooks stacked on her desk, her favorite sweater draped over the chair where she'd tossed it before getting dressed to go out. Linda cleaned the room weekly, dusting the surfaces and making the bed that Nancy would never sleep in again, maintaining it like a museum of interrupted dreams. People kept telling me I needed to accept reality, to move on, to let go, Linda recalled years later. But they didn't understand. Nancy wasn't gone to me. She was just somewhere else waiting for us to find her. The porch light that Linda had left burning the night Nancy disappeared never went out. Tom Robinson, practical and cost-conscious by nature, had initially suggested they could turn it off during daylight hours to save on electricity. But Linda's reaction had been so fierce, so protective of that small beacon, that he'd never mentioned it again. Neighbors began to associate the Robinson house with that single light glowing against the darkness, a symbol of maternal faith that refused to be extinguished. Every evening at 6 p.m., Linda would light a white pillar candle and place it in Nancy's bedroom window, a ritual she'd started during the first week of the search and had never abandoned. The candle would burn until bedtime, when Linda would blow it out while whispering the same prayer, "Bring her home safely. Help someone find the courage to tell the truth." The impact on Nancy's siblings was profound and complicated. Marcus, now 19 and a sophomore at Washington State University, carried guilt about being unable to protect his sister mixed with anger at God, the police, and the cruel randomness of the world. He'd changed his major from business to criminal justice, driven by a need to understand how someone could simply vanish without trace. Emma, 17 and a senior in high school, had developed anxiety that manifested as obsessive checking behaviors, locks, car doors, her siblings' whereabouts. She'd been accepted to several colleges, but refused to consider any school more than an hour from Moscow, unable to bear the thought of being far from home if Nancy somehow returned. Little Sophie, now 14, remembered Nancy as more of a fairy tale figure than a real sister, the perfect older sibling who'd read bedtime stories and helped with homework, and always knew how to make everything better. Sophie's friends sometimes asked about the sister who'd gone missing, and Sophie had learned to provide brief, matter-of-fact answers that discouraged further questions. Tom Robinson channeled his grief into practical action. He'd taken early retirement from the fire department and spent his days driving rural roads throughout eastern Washington and northern Idaho, convinced that persistence would eventually reveal some overlooked clue. His truck's odometer showed the evidence of his obsession, over 40,000 miles annually spent searching for his daughter. The financial strain was significant, but secondary to the emotional cost. The family had spent their savings on private investigators, psychics, and reward money. They'd mortgaged their house to hire a specialized search and recovery team from California, who used ground-penetrating radar and thermal imaging technology. Every lead, no matter how unlikely, represented hope worth pursuing at any cost. Linda had quit her job as an elementary school secretary, Nancy's chosen profession, because being around children Nancy's age proved unbearable. She found part-time work at the county assessor's office, processing property records that required attention to detail, but minimal human interaction. Her colleagues learned not to mention anniversaries, birthdays, or holidays, as these occasions sent Linda into periods of profound depression. The community's response evolved as the years passed. Initial widespread support gradually diminished as other crises demanded attention and as people grew weary of a mystery that seemed unsolvable. The annual vigils continued, but drew smaller crowds. Local media coverage decreased to perfunctory anniversary articles that recycled the same basic facts without new information. However, a core group of supporters never wavered. Nancy's sorority sisters, now graduated and scattered across the country, maintained a Facebook group that kept her memory alive and continued to generate tips and theories. Sarah Martinez, Nancy's former roommate, had become a victims' rights advocate, partly motivated by her frustration with the limitations she'd witnessed in Nancy's case. The Moscow Police Department kept Nancy's case active in the sense that new tips were still investigated and technological advances were applied when possible. Detective Martinez, now promoted to sergeant, reviewed the file quarterly, looking for connections he might have missed or new analytical approaches that might yield insights. Cold doesn't mean forgotten, Martinez explained to the Robinson family during one of their regular update meetings. It means we're waiting for the right piece of information, the right technological breakthrough, or the right person to come forward. Someone knows what happened to Nancy. Someone always knows. As Moscow, Idaho settled into the rhythm of the late 2010s, Nancy Robinson's disappearance had woven itself into the town's collective consciousness like scar tissue, permanent, occasionally painful, but accepted as part of the community's story. The university continued to grow. New students arrived each fall, unaware of the DC that had shaken their campus 7 years earlier, and life moved forward with the relentless momentum that characterizes college towns. Yet Nancy's absence continued to cast subtle shadows across Moscow's daily life. CJ's Tavern had installed a comprehensive security camera system and implemented a policy requiring staff to watch lone patrons leave safely. Other downtown establishments followed suit, creating an informal network of protective observation that might have prevented Nancy's fate had it existed in. The University of Idaho had established the Nancy Robinson Safety Initiative, providing additional lighting along walking routes between campus and downtown, emergency call boxes at strategic locations, and a late-night escort service for students traveling alone. The program represented good intentions and practical improvements, but also served as a constant reminder that danger could strike even in places that felt completely safe. Pastor Michael Chen of the Moscow Community Church had officiated at Nancy's memorial service in 2012, when the family finally acknowledged they needed a formal way to process their grief, even without a body to bury. The service had been held on what would have been Nancy's 22nd birthday, with hundreds of attendees sharing memories and prayers. Pastor Chen continued to include Nancy in his prayers each Sunday, mentioning her by name during the congregation's intercessions for the missing and lost. Nancy's disappearance changed how we think about prayer, Pastor Chen reflected during a 2018 interview. Usually, we pray for healing or recovery, assuming some resolution will come. But with Nancy, we learn to pray into the void, to maintain faith without answers, to love without closure. It challenged everyone's theology. The local high school had created a scholarship in Nancy's name, awarded annually to a graduating senior planning to study education. Each recipient received not only financial assistance, but also a personal letter from Linda Robinson, sharing memories of Nancy's passion for teaching and encouraging the scholarship winner to pursue their dreams with determination. Moscow's small business community had rallied around the Robinson family in ways both obvious and subtle. The hardware store never charged Tom for supplies he used in his ongoing search efforts. The local grocery store quietly donated food for the annual memorial gatherings. The flower shop provided arrangements for Nancy's memorial garden at no cost, understanding that the family's resources had been depleted by years of private investigation expenses. But the case's most profound impact was on how Moscow residents understood their own security and the nature of evil. The town had always prided itself on being the kind of place where people left doors unlocked and children played outside until dark. Nancy's disappearance introduced the uncomfortable reality that predators could exist anywhere, that tragedy could strike even the most careful and responsible young people. Detective Martinez, now in his final years before retirement, observed how the community's relationship with law enforcement had evolved. People expected us to solve Nancy's case because that's what happens in movies and TV shows, he noted. When we couldn't deliver that resolution, some folks lost faith in the system. Others developed a deeper appreciation for how complex these investigations really are. The annual memorial gatherings had settled into a pattern that reflected the community's long-term relationship with unresolved grief. Each October 15th, approximately 50 people would gather in the small park across from CJ's Tavern for a brief ceremony featuring prayers, shared memories, and a reading of any new developments in Nancy's case. The events were no longer covered by local media, unless there was actual news to report. Nancy's former classmates, now approaching 30, carried her memory into their adult lives in various ways. Several had named daughters after her. Others had chosen careers in law enforcement or victim advocacy. Some had moved away from Moscow, finding the constant reminders too difficult to bear, while others stayed precisely because leaving felt like abandoning Nancy. The University of Idaho's criminal justice program used Nancy's case as a teaching example, with Professor Sarah Williams incorporating it into her courses on cold case investigations and victim impact studies. Williams had to carefully balance educational value with respect for the Robinson family's ongoing pain, always emphasizing that Nancy represented a real person with real family members, still seeking answers. Students need to understand that behind every case file is a family that goes to bed every night without answers. Williams explained to her classes, Nancy Robinson wasn't just a victim or a statistic. She was someone's daughter, sister, friend. She had dreams and plans, and people who loved her. That human element can never be forgotten, even when cases remain unsolved for years. Social media had created new avenues for keeping Nancy's case visible. True crime enthusiasts occasionally featured her story on podcasts or blogs, though the Robinson family had mixed feelings about this attention. While they appreciated any effort to generate new tips, they also worried about sensationalism and misinformation spreading through channels they couldn't control. The Idaho State Crime Laboratory in Meridian had undergone massive technological upgrades between 2020 and 2023, transforming from a regional facility with basic capabilities into a sophisticated forensic center equipped with cutting-edge DNA analysis technology. Amanda Foster, the lab's new director, had arrived from the FBI's headquarters laboratory, with ambitious plans to apply advanced techniques to the state's most challenging cold cases. On a crisp morning in March 2023, Dr. Foster stood before a wall of evidence lockers in the lab's climate-controlled storage facility, each container representing an unsolved mystery. Nancy Robinson's case file occupied an entire section, boxes of clothing, photographs, trace evidence, and a single vial containing the DNA sample extracted from her recovered car 12 years earlier. Genetic genealogy and advanced touch DNA analysis have revolutionized cold case investigations, Dr. Foster explained to Detective Sarah Kim, Martinez's successor, who'd taken over Nancy's case the previous year. What seemed like insignificant trace evidence in 2011 could now provide the breakthrough we've been waiting for. The DNA sample from Nancy's car had yielded only a partial profile when originally tested, insufficient for comparison against CODIS, the national DNA database, but potentially valuable if enhanced, using modern techniques. Foster's team employed a process called low-copy number DNA analysis, which could generate profiles from samples containing fewer than 200 cells, compared to the 1,000+ cells required by older methods. Laboratory technician Michael Santos, a specialist in genetic genealogy, began the painstaking process of amplifying the DNA sample using polymerase chain reaction technology that hadn't existed in. The work required absolute precision. Any contamination could compromise evidence that had waited over a decade for analysis. "We're essentially taking a whisper and trying to turn it into a shout," Santos explained as he loaded the sample into the lab's newest genetic analyzer. "The DNA is degraded from age and environmental exposure, but if we can extract even a partial profile, we might be able to identify the person who touched Nancy's car." The process took 3 weeks. Santos worked in shifts around the clock, carefully monitoring each phase of amplification and analysis. The Robinson family had been informed of the renewed effort, but asked not to expect immediate results. They'd been disappointed too many times by promising leads that led nowhere. On April 18, 2023, the genetic analyzer produced results that made Santos call Dr. Foster at home at 11 p.m. The partial DNA profile was more complete than anyone had dared hope, sufficient to run through both CODIS and genealogical databases that had expanded dramatically since. The CODIS search yielded no immediate matches, but the genetic genealogy approach proved more promising. By comparing the DNA profile against publicly available genealogical databases, ACE-GED Match and Family Tree DNA, Santos could identify potential family members of the person who'd left DNA on Nancy's car. Working with genealogist consultant Jennifer Walsh, the same digital forensics specialist who'd worked Nancy's case originally, the team began constructing family trees based on genetic matches. The process was methodical and time-consuming, requiring analysis of shared DNA segments and geographical patterns to narrow down potential suspects. "We started with approximately 40 possible DNA matches, sharing various amounts of genetic material with our unknown subject," Walsh explained. "By analyzing their family trees and geographical locations, we could eliminate most of them and focus on candidates who lived in the Moscow area." The breakthrough came on May 15, 2023, when the analysis pointed to 3 potential candidates, all men, all living in Latah County in 2011, all sharing enough DNA markers to be considered persons of interest. Detective Kim obtained court orders to collect DNA samples from each man for direct comparison. The first 2 samples proved negative, creating the familiar disappointment that had characterized Nancy's case for over a decade. But the third sample, collected from 43-year-old mechanic Robert "Bobby" Hartwell, produced a match that sent shockwaves through the investigation team. Bobby Hartwell had lived in Moscow since 1995, operating a small auto repair shop on the outskirts of town. He was known throughout the community as a reliable mechanic who'd fixed cars for students, faculty, and local families for nearly 3 decades. Nancy herself had taken her Honda Civic to Hartwell's shop for routine maintenance just 6 weeks before her disappearance. The DNA match was conclusive, Dr. Foster later testified. The probability of the DNA belonging to someone other than Robert Hartwell was approximately 1 in 47 billion. This was our perpetrator. Detective Kim realized she needed to handle the arrest carefully. Hartwell had deep roots in the community and would likely have supporters who'd refuse to believe he could be connected to Nancy's disappearance. The investigation team spent 2 weeks conducting surveillance and gathering additional evidence before making their move. On May 30, 2023, Memorial Day, Detective Kim called Linda Robinson with news the family had waited 12 years to hear. We've identified the person responsible for Nancy's disappearance, and we're making an arrest today. The pre-dawn hours of May 30, 2023, found Detective Kim and her team positioned around Bobby Hartwell's modest ranch house on Birch Street, just 3 miles from where Nancy Robinson had vanished 12 years earlier. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The man they'd been searching for had been hiding in plain sight, fixing their cars and accepting their money, while carrying the secret of Nancy's fate. Bobby Hartwell emerged from his house at 6:15 a.m., as he had every weekday for the past 28 years, carrying a thermos of coffee and keys to his repair shop. At 55, he appeared older than his years, with graying hair and the weathered hands of someone who'd spent decades working with tools and machinery. He walked with a slight stoop common to mechanics who'd bent over engines for too many years. Bobby Hartwell, you're under arrest for the kidnapping and murder of Nancy Robinson, Detective Kim announced as tactical officers surrounded him in his driveway. Hartwell's reaction was telling, not surprise or confusion, but a kind of resigned defeat, as if he'd been expecting this moment for years. "I want a lawyer," were his only words, as they placed him in handcuffs and read him his rights. Neighbors emerged from their houses to witness the arrest, many expressing shock that the man who'd fixed their lawnmowers and changed their oil could be connected to Moscow's most notorious crime. The investigation team had spent the previous 2 weeks building a comprehensive case against Hartwell, uncovering evidence that painted a disturbing picture of a trusted community member living a double life. A search warrant executed at his auto shop revealed meticulous records dating back to 2011, including a service order for Nancy's Honda Civic, dated September 3, 2011. Just 6 weeks before her disappearance. Hartwell had worked on Nancy's car, Detective Kim explained to the assembled media. He had her personal information, her phone number, and detailed knowledge of her vehicle. The DNA evidence proves he had physical contact with her car on the night she disappeared. Further investigation revealed that Hartwell had been following Nancy for several weeks before her disappearance. Security footage from various locations around Moscow showed his distinctive blue pickup truck in proximity to Nancy's movements, outside her apartment building, near the university buildings where she attended classes, and in the parking lot of CJ's Tavern on multiple occasions throughout September and October. The most damning evidence came from Hartwell's own business records. On October 16, 2011, the day after Nancy's disappearance, Hartwell had canceled all his scheduled appointments and closed his shop for what he claimed was emergency family business. Phone records showed no calls to or from family members that day, and subsequent investigation revealed he'd driven to a remote area of the Clearwater National Forest, approximately 90 miles from Moscow. Geological survey specialist Dr. Robert Kim analyzed GPS data from Hartwell's cell phone for October. The data showed Hartwell had spent several hours in an area of dense forest, accessible only by logging roads, exactly the type of location where someone might dispose of evidence or conceal a body. The GPS coordinates put Hartwell in an extremely isolated area, with no legitimate reason for being there, Dr. Kim testified. The location is approximately 8 miles from the nearest maintained road, accessible only by 4-wheel drive vehicles. It's the perfect place to hide something you never want to find. A forensics team was immediately dispatched to the coordinates identified by Hartwell's phone data. Using ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs, they began systematically searching the area. On June 8, 2023, investigators discovered a shallow grave containing human remains approximately 400 yards from where Hartwell's phone had pinged in. The remains were transported to the Idaho State Crime Laboratory for identification. Dental records confirmed what the Robinson family had both feared and hoped to learn for 12 years. The remains belonged to Nancy Robinson. She had finally come home. Dr. Patricia Walsh, the state medical examiner, determined that Nancy had died from blunt force trauma to the head, consistent with being struck by a heavy object. The condition of the remains made it impossible to determine the exact cause of death, but the evidence suggested Nancy had been killed shortly after her disappearance and transported to the burial site. The forensic evidence tells a clear story, Dr. Walsh explained during her preliminary report. Nancy Robinson was murdered, and her body was concealed in a location chosen specifically to prevent discovery. This was a premeditated crime carried out by someone with knowledge of remote areas and access to equipment needed to transport and bury human remains. The discovery of Nancy's body allowed investigators to search more thoroughly for additional evidence. Metal detectors located her missing jewelry, approximately 50 feet from the gravesite, her high school class ring, a necklace given to her by her grandmother, and the silver earrings she'd been wearing the night she disappeared. Most significantly, investigators discovered Nancy's cell phone, buried separately from her body and wrapped in plastic. The phone's memory card had been damaged by years of exposure to moisture and soil, but digital forensics specialists were able to recover partial data that provided crucial evidence about Nancy's final hours. The recovered data showed that Nancy had received a phone call at 12:41 a.m. on October 16, 2011, 4 minutes after her final text message to Sarah Martinez. The call lasted 18 minutes and came from a prepaid cell phone registered to a false name, but purchased with a credit card traced to Bobby Hartwell. Hartwell called Nancy, claiming her car was making unusual noises when she drove it after leaving the bar. Detective Kim pieced together from the evidence. He convinced her to meet him at a remote location where he claimed he could quickly check the engine. Nancy, trusting a mechanic who'd worked on her car before, agreed to the meeting that cost her life. News of Bobby Hartwell's arrest spread through Moscow, Idaho like wildfire on the afternoon of May 30, 2023, transforming Memorial Day from a quiet holiday into a day the community would never forget. Within hours, Hartwell's auto repair shop on Industrial Road was surrounded by news vans, police tape, and clusters of residents struggling to process the revelation that someone they'd known and trusted for decades was responsible for their town's most devastating crime. Martha Stevens, who'd lived next door to Hartwell for 15 years, stood in her driveway, watching investigators search his property, tears streaming down her face. "Bobby fixed my washing machine just last month," she told reporters. "He helped me carry groceries when I broke my ankle. He always remembered my grandson's birthday. How could someone who seemed so normal do something so horrible?" The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming for Moscow residents who'd interacted with Hartwell regularly over the years. He'd sponsored a Little League team. He'd donated repair services to single mothers who couldn't afford car maintenance. He'd been a fixture at community barbecues and church fundraisers. The man they thought they knew seemed incompatible with the monster capable of murdering Nancy Robinson. Detective Kim found herself fielding hundreds of phone calls from residents reporting interactions with Hartwell, many wondering if they'd been potential victims who'd simply been fortunate enough to escape his attention. Several women recalled feeling uncomfortable during visits to his shop, though they dismissed their uneasiness at the time as imagination or paranoia. "We're looking at every interaction Hartwell had with young women over the past 15 years, Detective Kim announced during a press conference. "We want to determine if Nancy was his only victim or if there were other crimes we haven't discovered yet." The investigation team expanded to include FBI specialists in serial crimes and behavioral analysis. Agent Rebecca Martinez, no relation to the original detective, had extensive experience with predators who used their professional positions to access victims. She immediately recognized patterns in Hartwell's behavior that suggested Nancy might not have been his first victim. Hartwell's shop records show he worked on vehicles belonging to dozens of young women between 2008 and 2011. Agent Martinez discovered he kept detailed personal information about his customers, addresses, phone numbers, class schedules, work schedules. This level of record keeping goes far beyond normal business practices. A systematic review of missing person cases throughout the Pacific Northwest revealed several unsolved disappearances that shared similarities with Nancy's case. Young women who'd had their cars serviced at small, independent repair shops before vanishing without trace. While none could be definitively linked to Hartwell, the patterns were disturbing enough to warrant further investigation. The most shocking revelation came from Hartwell's own family. His ex-wife, Patricia Hartwell, who'd divorced him in 2015 after 20 years of marriage, contacted investigators with information she'd been afraid to share for years. She described a husband who'd become increasingly controlling and obsessive, particularly regarding young women who brought their cars to his shop. Bobby would talk about his female customers constantly, Patricia revealed during a lengthy interview. He'd describe what they wore, how they smelled, what their voices sounded like. He kept photographs of their cars in files at home, along with copies of their registration information. When I asked why, he said it was for business purposes, but it felt wrong. Patricia also revealed that Hartwell had been absent from their home on October 15 and 16, 2011, claiming he was helping a friend with car trouble. She'd been suspicious when he returned with muddy clothes and scratches on his hands, but had accepted his explanation about working on a vehicle stuck in a ditch. "I should have said something years ago," Patricia sobbed during her police interview. "I had suspicions, but I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe if I'd spoken up, Nancy's family wouldn't have suffered for so long." The search of Hartwell's property yielded additional disturbing evidence. Hidden in a storage shed behind his house, investigators discovered a collection of personal items that appeared to be trophies from various crimes: jewelry, hair accessories, clothing items, and photographs of young women who couldn't be immediately identified. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, the forensic psychologist who'd consulted on Nancy's case in 2011, returned to analyze Hartwell's behavior patterns and psychological profile. Her updated assessment painted a picture of a sophisticated predator who'd spent years perfecting his methods. "Hartwell represents the most dangerous type of serial offender," Dr. Harper concluded. "He was organized, patient, and skilled at presenting a trustworthy facade. He used his legitimate business to identify and access victims, then relied on his reputation in the community to deflect suspicion." The impact on Nancy's family was complex and overwhelming. Linda Robinson had waited 12 years to learn her daughter's fate, but the reality of Nancy's murder and the discovery that her killer had been part of their community all along brought a new kind of pain mixed with relief. "At least we know," Linda said during a brief statement to the media. "For 12 years, we've lived with questions and hope and terrible uncertainty. Knowing is horrible, but not knowing was worse. Nancy can finally rest in peace." Tom Robinson's reaction was more volatile. The man who'd spent years driving rural roads searching for his daughter had unknowingly taken his truck to Hartwell's shop for repairs on multiple occasions. The realization that he'd shaken hands with Nancy's killer, had paid him money, had trusted him with vehicle maintenance, sent Tom into a rage that required intervention from family members and counselors. The Robinson family announced plans for Nancy's funeral, a service they'd been unable to hold for over a decade. The ceremony would take place at Moscow Community Church, with burial at the city cemetery, where a headstone had waited empty since. The trial of Robert Bobby Hartwell began on January 8, 2025, in the Latah County Courthouse, a modest brick building that had never hosted proceedings as momentous or emotionally charged as the prosecution of Nancy Robinson's killer. Judge Patricia Morrison, a 20-year veteran of the bench, understood that this case represented more than individual justice. It was Moscow's reckoning with betrayal, loss, and the disturbing reality that evil could hide behind the most ordinary facade. The prosecution team, led by Idaho Attorney General Sarah Kim, who'd been promoted following her successful investigation of Nancy's case, built their argument around the DNA evidence, Hartwell's documented stalking behavior, and the geographical evidence, placing him at Nancy's burial site. The case was circumstantial but overwhelming in its totality. Robert Hartwell used his position as a trusted mechanic to identify, stalk, and ultimately murder Nancy Robinson, Kim stated during her opening argument. "The evidence will show that he was a predator who spent months planning Nancy's death, who deceived her into meeting him at an isolated location, and who killed her in cold blood before concealing her body for over 12 years. Defense attorney Michael Santos faced a nearly impossible task. His client's DNA on the victim's car, his cell phone data placing him at the burial site, and his documented history of suspicious behavior toward young women created a prosecutorial narrative that seemed airtight. Santos's strategy focused on challenging the DNA evidence chain of custody and suggesting that Hartwell's presence at various locations could be explained by his legitimate business activities. The prosecution wants you to believe that Robert Hartwell is a monster, Santos argued, but the evidence shows a hard-working man who served this community for nearly 30 years. Yes, he worked on Nancy Robinson's car. Yes, he was familiar with remote areas from years of hunting and fishing, but none of this proves he committed murder. The most compelling testimony came from Dr. Amanda Foster, the DNA specialist, whose advanced analysis had broken the case open. She explained the genetic genealogy process in terms the jury could understand, demonstrating how modern science could extract meaningful evidence from samples that would have been useless 12 years earlier. The DNA on Nancy's car door handle could only have come from Robert Hartwell, Dr. Foster testified. The statistical probability of error is less than 1 in 47 billion. This is not circumstantial evidence. This is scientific fact. FBI agent Rebecca Martinez presented evidence of Hartwell's stalking behavior, including security footage showing his truck following Nancy's movements in the weeks before her disappearance. The timeline she constructed painted a picture of calculated predation that chilled the packed courtroom. Nancy's family testified about their 12 years of anguish and uncertainty. Linda Robinson, now 58 and visibly weathered by more than a decade of grief, described the nightly ritual of lighting candles and the daily pain of not knowing her daughter's fate. Every morning for 12 years I woke up hoping this would be the day we found Nancy. Linda testified, her voice steady despite tears. Every night I went to bed wondering if she was cold, if she was scared, if she was calling for us. The defendant stole more than Nancy's life. He stole our ability to grieve properly, to find peace, to move forward. The most dramatic moment came when Tom Robinson confronted Hartwell directly during his victim impact statement. The courtroom fell silent as the man who'd unknowingly shaken his daughter's killer's hand multiple times over the years addressed him face to face. "You looked me in the eye dozens of times," Tom said, his voice filled with controlled fury. "You took my money for oil changes and brake repairs while you knew where my daughter was buried. You attended community events and acted concerned about Nancy's disappearance while you were the one responsible for our pain. That level of deception, that complete lack of human decency, is something I'll never understand." Hartwell himself never testified, following his attorney's advice, despite public pressure for him to explain his actions. His silence in the face of overwhelming evidence served to further inflame community sentiment against him. The jury deliberated for just 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges: first-degree murder, kidnapping, and concealment of evidence. Judge Morrison sentenced Hartwell to life in prison without possibility of parole, plus an additional 25 years for the kidnapping conviction. Robert Hartwell betrayed this community's trust in the most profound way possible, Judge Morrison stated during sentencing. He used his position as a respected businessman to identify and victimize Nancy Robinson, then compounded his crime by allowing her family to suffer for over 12 years without answers. This court finds no mitigating factors that would justify anything less than the maximum sentence allowed by law. The conviction brought a measure of closure to Moscow's long nightmare, but also prompted difficult conversations about how communities can protect themselves from predators who hide in plain sight. The local police department implemented new protocols for investigating missing persons cases, emphasizing the importance of advanced forensic analysis and the danger of dismissing potential suspects simply because they appear trustworthy. Nancy's former sorority sisters established a scholarship fund in her memory, specifically supporting students studying forensic science and criminal justice. The University of Idaho created the Nancy Robinson Cold Case Laboratory, where students work under faculty supervision to apply advanced techniques to unsolved crimes throughout the region. The Robinson family announced plans to move away from Moscow after Nancy's funeral, seeking a fresh start in a place not saturated with painful memories. But they also committed to maintaining Nancy's memorial garden and ensuring that her story continued to serve as a reminder that justice, while sometimes delayed, should never be abandoned. Nancy's case proves that families should never give up hope, Detective Kim reflected after the trial. Technology advances, circumstances change, and eventually, the truth emerges. Every cold case represents someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone who deserves justice no matter how much time has passed. On a quiet evening in late February 2025, Linda Robinson walked slowly up the front steps of the house on Elm Street that had been her home for 23 years, carrying a single white candle, the same type she'd lit in Nancy's bedroom window for over 13 years. But tonight would be different. Tonight, the ritual that had sustained her through the darkest period of her life would finally come to an end. Nancy's funeral had taken place 3 weeks earlier at Moscow Community Church, with over 800 people attending to pay their respects to a young woman whose death had haunted their community for more than a decade. The service had been both heartbreaking and healing, a celebration of Nancy's life, mixed with acknowledgement of the collective trauma her disappearance had inflicted on everyone who'd known and loved her. The cemetery on the outskirts of Moscow now held Nancy's remains in a grave marked by a simple granite headstone, reading Nancy Marie Robinson, beloved daughter, sister, and friend. Your light lives on. The inscription was surrounded by teachers' apples, a tribute to the profession Nancy had dreamed of pursuing before her life was cut short at 19. Linda sat in Nancy's bedroom for the final time, looking around at the space that had served as both shrine and torture chamber for so many years. Tomorrow she and Tom would finish packing for their move to Coeur d'Alene, where they planned to start over in a place not haunted by memories of what they'd lost. The house would be sold to a young family with small children, new life-filling spaces that had been frozen in time. The broader lessons of Nancy's case had reverberated throughout law enforcement communities across the Pacific Northwest. The success of genetic genealogy in solving her murder had led to renewed efforts to apply similar techniques to other cold cases. The Idaho State Crime Laboratory had received federal funding to expand its advanced DNA analysis capabilities, with the goal of addressing the backlog of unsolved crimes that had accumulated over decades. Dr. Amanda Foster had become a national expert in cold case DNA analysis, consulting with laboratories throughout the country and training investigators in the latest techniques. Her work on Nancy's case had directly led to the resolution of 16 other cold cases in Idaho alone, bringing closure to families who'd waited years for answers about their missing loved ones. The case had also highlighted the importance of community vigilance without paranoia. Moscow residents had learned that evil could hide behind familiar faces and trusted relationships, but they'd also discovered the power of collective determination to seek justice. The annual memorial gatherings would continue, but they'd evolved from desperate pleas for information into celebrations of Nancy's life and reminders that no victim should ever be forgotten. For the criminal justice system, Nancy's case demonstrated both the limitations of older investigative techniques and the revolutionary potential of modern forensic science. Detective Kim had implemented new protocols requiring periodic review of cold cases as technology advanced, ensuring that evidence dismissed as unusable in previous eras would be re-examined with contemporary capabilities. The University of Idaho's Nancy Robinson Cold Case Laboratory has become a model for similar programs nationwide, combining advanced forensic training with real-world application to unsolved crimes. Students working in the laboratory understood they weren't just completing academic exercises, they were potentially providing answers to families who'd waited years for closure. Perhaps most importantly, Nancy's case had reinforced the critical importance of never giving up hope, no matter how much time passed or how impossible resolution seemed. Linda Robinson's 13 years of lighting candles and maintaining vigil had inspired other families facing similar tragedies, demonstrating that love and determination could sustain even the deepest grief. As Linda prepared to light the final candle in Nancy's bedroom window, she reflected on the long journey from that terrible October night in 2011 to this moment of bittersweet closure. The pain of Nancy's loss would never completely heal, but the uncertainty that had amplified that pain for so many years was finally gone. The candle flame flickered to life one last time, casting familiar shadows across Nancy's childhood photographs and academic achievements. Linda whispered the prayer she'd repeated thousands of times. "Thank you for bringing her home. Thank you for helping us find the truth." Then, for the first time since October 15, 2011, Linda Robinson blew out the candle and turned off the porch light. Nancy had finally come home and her family could begin to heal. The vigil was over, but Nancy's memory would burn brightly forever in the hearts of everyone who'd known and loved her. Outside, Moscow settled into the quiet darkness of a winter night, a community forever changed by one family's refusal to surrender hope and the power of modern science to illuminate even the deepest mysteries. Nancy Robinson's case was closed, but her legacy of perseverance, love, and the relentless pursuit of justice would continue to inspire others facing similar darkness. The candle was extinguished, but the light lived on.